So, Donald Trump has just locked up $89 billion in accounts belonging to the Canadian government and institutions stored in U.S. banks. He relied on the identical legal power that the U.S. has employed to seize assets from Iran, Russia, North Korea, Syria, and Venezuela. The International Emergency Economic Powers Act, the monetary tool set aside for adversary nations and groups involved in terrorism. And he simply unleashed it on America's nearest partner. Mark Carney's reply arrived in under 6 hours. And it didn't merely offset the seizure. It sparked the biggest one-day shift of overseas national holdings out of U.S. financial entities ever seen in the worldwide monetary network. 2.3 trillion shifting due to a single phrase Carney uttered to all governments worldwide. Warren Buffett labeled it the most damaging economic choice by a U.S. leader since Nixon shut down the gold exchange in 1971. But this is the aspect that ought to leave everyone in Washington feeling genuinely sick. Trump seized $89 billion that was scarcely present. Canada had already shifted its funds discreetly during the prior 90 days. The seizure was a weapon aimed at a vacant safe, and Carney leveraged it to persuade the whole globe to clear out their own. Allow me to guide you through what Trump really executed. The executive order got signed on Sunday night and became active Monday morning. It called upon the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, IEEPA, the statutory power granting the president exceptional ability to lock foreign holdings amid what the executive deems a national crisis. This isn't an ordinary commerce instrument. This isn't a duty. This is the strongest economic tool in the U.S. toolkit. The identical law used to immobilize Iranian holdings following the embassy takeover. The identical law used to secure Russian elite wealth after the assault on Ukraine. Each prior application of this power focused on countries the U.S. viewed as antagonistic foes, opponents, outlaw regimes, backers of terror, and Trump just directed it toward Canada. The directive immobilized 3 types of Canadian holdings. First, accounts of the Canadian government in U.S. banks. Second, accounts of crown corporations. The monetary reserves of Canadian publicly owned companies. Third, accounts for Canadian institutional investments, encompassing retirement funds and academic endowments, overall immobilized, roughly $89 billion. The lawful basis referenced an economic crisis stemming from aggressive Canadian commerce behaviors that endanger U.S. national safety and fiscal steadiness. Legal experts promptly disputed the depiction. EPA demands a real crisis. A commerce disagreement with a free market ally sharing the planet's longest unguarded frontier fails to reach that level. The immobilization was instant, no gradual implementation, no official alert whatsoever. Canadian monetary authorities found out about the event when Monday morning deals couldn't process. Electronic payments rebounded, entry to accounts got blocked. Canada's finance department found out what occurred via urgent calls from its own banking entities, not the White House. No telephone discussion, no official message. Canadian entities attempted to reach their own funds and learned a foreign regime had sealed the entrance overnight. The planned outcome was direct. With $89 billion immobilized in U.S. banks, Canada would face immense strain to negotiate on U.S. conditions. The funds served as bargaining power. The accounts were captives. It followed the reasoning of an abductor used in global finance. And it presumed the target lacked a backup strategy. They presumed incorrectly, because Mark Carney, someone who dedicated 13 years at Goldman Sachs, mastering precisely how monetary networks operate, who managed the Bank of Canada amid a worldwide economic meltdown, who oversaw the Bank of England during Brexit, had been readying for this situation for months. 6 hours following the immobilization's activation, Carney stood at a lectern in Ottawa. He started with a phrase that drained the energy from every news outlet globally. I wish to reassure Canadians and the global audience that Canada's monetary standing is solid. The measures implemented by the United States this morning impact about $12 billion in Canadian institutional holdings, not $89 billion. $12 billion. The space fell quiet. Carney clarified that Canadian intelligence collaborating with the Bank of Canada had evaluated the chance of a U.S. asset immobilization as likely over the last 4 months. When the evaluation shifted from feasible to likely, Canada launched what the Finance Department privately termed Operation Sovereign Shield. Across 90 days, Canada methodically pulled back national and institutional holdings from U.S. financial entities. The shifts were performed slowly in quantities designed to evade drawing market notice. Holdings were relocated to Canadian local banks, to the Bank of England, to the European Central Bank storage setups, and to a fresh Canadian national wealth entity based in Switzerland. Each shift was recorded. Each host entity was arranged beforehand. The initiative was carried out with the accuracy of a central banker who grasped exactly how funds flow across the international network. From the $89 billion the United States thought it was immobilizing, $77 billion had already been relocated. What stayed, around $12 billion, was intentionally kept behind. Leftover amounts in accounts that would have sparked concerns if completely cleared. Trump immobilized $89 billion that didn't exist. He directed a weapon at a safe that had been silently cleared over 3 months by a person who anticipated the weapon's arrival. That was step 1. Step 2 arrived in under 1 hour. Canada immobilized all U.S. government and business holdings in Canadian financial entities using the Special Economic Measures Act. Overall, immobilized roughly $143 billion. This encompassed U.S. business affiliate working accounts for every significant American firm operating in Canada. U.S. retirement fund stakes in Canadian stocks, U.S. government bonds handled via Canadian mediators, U.S. bank division working funds, $143 billion immobilized by Canada compared to $12 billion truly seized by the United States. The captor had just realized 2 facts at once. Their captive had already fled, and the captive possessed more captives themselves, 12 times more. Step 3 was the step that stunned markets. Carney delivered a follow-up announcement, this one directed straight to the global audience. If the United States of America will immobilize the monetary holdings of its nearest partner, a NATO associate, a G7 country, a Five Eyes intelligence associate, then no country's holdings in U.S. financial entities are secure. Not European holdings, not Japanese holdings, not Korean holdings, not Australian holdings. Then he uttered the phrase that will be examined in finance curricula for the coming century. Your funds in U.S. banks are not a holding. They are a captive. That phrase shattered the international monetary network, not due to its flair, because it was accurate. And every finance leader, every central banker, every national wealth fund overseer who listened to it recognized immediately what the logical reaction was. Relocate your funds. Step 4 was complete monetary separation. Carney declared the instant launch of the Canadian-European transaction system for all direct commerce with EU countries, sidestepping the US dollar completely. He declared direct currency exchange pacts with Japan, South Korea, the UK, and Australia. He declared that all Canadian national reserves would be stored solely in non-US entities, henceforth as ongoing policy. 4 steps, 6 hours, safe cleared, retaliation at 12:01, a phrase that informed the globe their funds aren't secure. The immobilization was a handgun. Carney converted it into an atomic device. And then the markets reacted, not to the immobilization. The immobilization was manageable once Carney disclosed only $12 billion was really seized. The markets reacted to the worldwide alert to your funds are a captive, to the awareness that every overseas government with holdings in U.S. banks had just received motivation to shift their funds elsewhere. The Dow started dropping the instant Carney's follow-up announcement reached the news feeds. Bank equities spearheaded the plunge. J.P. Morgan Chase declined 9%. Bank of America dropped 12%. Citigroup plummeted 14%. Wells Fargo, Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley all decreased between 8 and 15%. The industry-wide drop was the harshest one-day result for U.S. bank equities since the initial phase of the pandemic. The cause was foundational. If overseas governments start pulling national holdings from U.S. banks, the banks forfeit deposits. They forfeit the inexpensive capital that foreign deposits supply. Norway's National Wealth Fund started an urgent evaluation of its U.S. financial entity vulnerability in hours. Saudi Arabia's Public Investment Fund commenced protective shifts. Singapore's GIC and Temasek released announcements regarding reevaluating location concentration hazard. The European Central Bank assembled an urgent meeting. Overall projected holdings starting relocation or evaluation processes in 24 hours, $2.3 trillion. Consider that proportion. Trump immobilized $89 billion in Canadian holdings, of which merely $12 billion was truly present. Carney's reply sparked the relocation or evaluation of $2.3 trillion in worldwide holdings away from U.S. entities. That is a proportion of almost 200 to 1. The U.S. dollar fell 3.2% versus a group of key currencies, the harshest one-day drop in more than 10 years. The drop wasn't fueled by commerce figures. It was fueled by the disappearance of confidence, the dollar's primary currency position, the advantage that permits the United States to lend inexpensively and extend monetary influence worldwide, relies wholly on overseas governments believing that their dollar holdings are protected from politics. That confidence was broken in one executive directive. Warren Buffett's announcement arrived with the authority of 7 decades in finance. Berkshire Hathaway maintains huge stakes in U.S. bank equities. The plunge was draining his firm billions while he talked. "I've been placing money in U.S. financial entities for 60 years, Buffett stated. Today, for the first time in those 60 years, I'm doubting that choice. Immobilizing an ally's bank accounts is the economic version of torching your own home to harm your neighbor, except the home you torch is the one where everybody else stores their treasures. The U.S. monetary network is the globe's bank. Nations store their reserves here because they believe their funds are shielded from political danger. That confidence required 80 years to establish. It was ruined by one executive directive immobilizing the accounts of America's nearest partner." On Carney's reply, Buffett was exact. Carney didn't have to overcome the immobilization. The immobilization overcame itself. All he had to do was highlight it, direct attention to it, say to the globe, "See what they did to us. You're next." One phrase, 12 words. Your funds in U.S. banks are not a holding. They are a captive. That phrase will burden the United States more than any duty, any penalty, any commerce battle, any armed engagement in its past. Buffett disclosed that Berkshire started cutting its U.S. bank equity vulnerability 12 months earlier. Not because we expected this particular directive, because the trend indicated the U.S. monetary network was evolving from a worldwide utility into a political tool. Political tools make lousy long-term placements. The rest of the globe is arriving at the same judgment today that we arrived at a year earlier. The distinction is we had 12 months to ready. They have 12 hours. His final judgment struck at the core. The dollar is valued at whatever the globe's confidence in U.S. institutions is valued at. Today, that confidence is valued at far less than it was yesterday. Confidence requires generations to establish and instants to ruin. This is the most damaging economic choice by a U.S. leader since Nixon shut the gold window. The international repercussions surpassed all expectations. 11 national wealth funds officially declared diversification evaluations in 48 hours. Combined holdings under evaluation roughly $4.7 trillion. The European Central Bank sped up initiatives for a euro-centered substitute to dollar processing networks. China broadened RMB transaction packs with a dozen extra countries. And Canada, the nation that was meant to be forced into submission. Canada's monetary network was operating as usual. Canadian banks noted higher deposits as entities brought back holdings. The Toronto Stock Exchange even climbed a bit as global investors decided Canada was the more secure spot for their funds. The tool struck the incorrect mark. It was meant to injure Canada. Canada's markets increased. America's decreased. U.S. bank executives were in outright rebellion. Jamie Dimon apparently informed a top official, "You just provided every overseas government on earth a motivation to remove their funds from our banks. Do you understand what that does to our deposit foundation?" The Federal Reserve conducted urgent talks on liquidity aid. U.S. banks were shedding foreign deposits live, not a fear-induced rush, a sensible, systematic, lasting redistribution by the most advanced entities on Earth. So, this is our current position. Trump issued an executive directive immobilizing $89 billion in Canadian accounts, but Canada had already relocated $77 billion, leaving just $12 billion truly immobilized. Carney retaliated by immobilizing $143 billion in U.S. holdings, a 12.1 proportion. Then he informed the globe that their funds in U.S. banks are a captive. That phrase sparked the shift of $2.3 trillion in worldwide holdings away from U.S. entities. Bank equities shed $340 billion in market value. The dollar endured its harshest drop in 10 years. 11 national wealth funds launched exit evaluations amounting to $4.7 trillion. The EU hastened Euro global expansion. China grew the RMB. The dollar's influence was never rooted in armed might. It was rooted in confidence. That confidence was the lone most precious resource the United States owned. It was the unseen base upon which U.S. economic supremacy stood for 8 decades. And it was ruined in one executive directive issued by a leader who believed he was penalizing Canada. He wasn't penalizing Canada. Canada had already departed. He was penalizing the dollar. He was penalizing every U.S. bank that relies on foreign deposits. He was penalizing every American whose pension funds reside in portfolios holding bank equities. He was penalizing 330 million Americans who count on the reliability of a monetary network that the rest of the globe is now silently choosing to forsake. Trump immobilized Canada's bank accounts and believed he was detaining a captive. Carney demonstrated to the globe the safe was vacant, retaliated by immobilizing 12 times the sum, and uttered one phrase that will resonate across international finance for a generation. Your funds in U.S. banks are not a holding. They are a captive. That phrase burdened the United States more than any duty, any commerce battle, any armed clash in its past because it revealed the truth. And the truth once revealed cannot be concealed.